Well, good afternoon if you are in Houston, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, New York City. Good evening if you are in Naples, Italy for a change, or Stockholm, Sweden. Greetings to people all around the world. I know we have a listener tonight in Johannesburg. She's listening in, so greetings to you. Greetings to people all around the world who follow Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is what in American English we describe as a young man in a hurry. His name is Reginald Smith Jr., but he's in such a hurry we call him Reggie. And he is a baritone, a wonderful baritone, joining us today from his home in Houston. Reggie, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, you have a vast repertoire. And, many baritones, many singers in all voice categories tend to be sort of categorized by what is known in German and in opera as a Fach, which kind of means a group of roles that seem congenial to a particular person, whether by voice, by temperament, whatever. But you sing, and you sing incredibly well, a wide range of leading and supporting baritone roles that's so big. Did you, at the beginning of your career, think I'm going to have a Fach, or how did these roles come to you? Because we go from Amonasro to Porgy to Alfio to the older Emile in Champion by Terence Blanchard to Don Alfonso and Così fan tutte. That's already a huge range right there. It's just a few roles. To, by the way, the Pirate King and the Pirates of Penzance. That's a massive range of roles. To the Verdi Requiem. I mean, really, did you start out thinking you were on a particular path as a baritone, or how did this happen?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for acknowledging the vast amount of work that I do. And just, I do a lot of crazy stuff, I tell you. I just really enjoy it all. I've never had a typical lyric baritone voice. I didn't sing the Largo al factotum from Barbara of Seville and the sort of typical baritone things you sing out of the gate. So my voice has always had to fit in the cracks and crevices of the standard repertoire, which has left me, in some ways, could be a more difficult road to travel, but definitely a more interesting road. And I'm a big person. I have a big voice, and my voice is very rangy. I can sing some of the higher things, some of the lower things. And so, especially starting out, it was, what can you do? What fits? What can we hire you for? And so, especially, before my time in the Houston Grand Opera Studio and leaving the Houston Grand Opera Studio, I did a lot of what I call the soubrette low voice baritone repertoire, right? It doesn't have to be really high.
That already covers a huge range. I know what you mean by soubrette, but define soubrette for our listeners.
well, this is exactly what I was saying. In this case, this repertoire, it's not necessarily high, and it's not necessarily low. You have a lot of things that sit in the middle, and you have to make a big presence in a short amount of time, and then you go home. And a lot of times they're the crux of the opera, things that help change the trajectory. And so sometimes they're cast by basses, sometimes they're cast with baritones, and all in between. And so that's why it's kind of soubrette in the sense that the range is a very limited sort of collection of notes, but not necessarily the singer has a limited collection of notes. But that means I've done a lot of Bonzo and Madame Butterfly.
Yeah.
You come in, you break up the wedding. That's my jam. Monterone in Rigoletto.
A wonderful role.
Yeah,
the father with the curse, yeah.
Without
So
Monterone,
I'm
you
going
have
to
no
further
opera.
combine these operatic terms and dub you something you may not have been called yet. a Helden soubrette. Which for listeners, Helden means heroic. So a Helden tenor, Helden soprano tend to do the Wagner and some of the Strauss roles
It's so
because
funny because it's so
you have
accurate.
that in you too. That you soubrette being the sort of Kathleen Battle roles and like the Roberta Peter roles, those kind of roles.
Yeah,
So it's everything from that to George London.
that's right. That's right. The Duke in Romeo and Juliet, the
Yeah.
speaker in Magic Flute, So I did a lot of these things, but what I would do early on and with my manager, we would say, okay, if you want to hire me to sing the Bonzo in Madame Butterfly, I'd also like to cover Sharpless, which is the leading baritone role. And so then when we would have a cover run, or they would hear me in rehearsals singing Sharpless, they say, "Oh, you can do that rap. Oh, that does sound good." I'm like,
Mhm.
"Yeah, well, yeah." Same, Monterone, you cover Rigoletto and they say, "Oh, wow, you can do this." Well, yeah. And so that's kind of where we sort of started in terms of getting your foot in the door, getting out there, starting out in the career path. Um, and then, as the voice started to grow, and different opportunities came about, I've always been a choir nerd more than anything. I'm a choir nerd. And so when the concert repertoire started to come in, that became very interesting to me. And I could do Carmina Burana and Elijah and the Brahms Requiem and Beethoven 9 and Beethoven Missa Solemnis and I've done the Mozart Requiem, which I don't know how much I'll do now.
Mhm.
And so a lot of that repertoire started to come in and would definitely take up places in the schedule where maybe opera was a little down because it's January or so. Um, and so fortunately, I really enjoy that, and so um, I've been called on more and more to do a lot of the concert things. I love doing recitals, and I love to go along with my Helden heroic soubrette repertoire. People would always say, I wonder if he can sing softly, and I said, well, when you're singing Bonzo, you're not supposed to sing softly, not in the big, the big condemning moment. And so when I would do concerts and recitals, especially recitals with piano, they would say, "Oh, he has such intimate singing." Well, yeah, I'm not having to scream at anybody, and
Mhm.
so so I do a lot of recital work as well. But when it comes down to the operatic roles that I do now, one, I'm a busybody by nature, and I like to mix it up, and I like a good challenge. And so I'll go from singing something like Old Emile in Champion, and literally what happened at Lyric Opera of Chicago, we finished Champion on Sunday and started Aida rehearsal on Monday.
Uh,
Completely different singing Amonasro, singing Aida's father. And so I enjoy having the versatility in my schedule, in my voice, and certainly in the repertoire. I play lots of fathers and bad guys. And
let's
so
talk a
when I
bit
can
about
do things like the Pirate King, it's always nice to do, or Falstaff, it's nice to do something comedic to go along with my fathers and bad guys.
let's get to him for a moment, but let's talk about because not everybody knows the opera champion. I happened to see it before it came to the Met. I saw it in Washington
Hmm.
and loved it in Washington, and I think it was tightened and somewhat changed when it got to New York. And I think it came to Chicago after New York. And it's based on the life of the boxer Emil Griffiths, who in the opera there's the older and the younger, and the older has been punched in the head too many times, and his memory is a bit faded. And we look at him in the past, and then the younger, we see some of the story that is told of him, which I'm going to put it down to the most basic terms. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, I believe. and he hit someone so hard that unfortunately the opponent died a few days later. He was privately gay. This was about 1962 and was not allowed to really bring that forth. And one of the key lines in the opera is, I'm allowed, people like me if I kill a man, but not if I love a man.
Oh yeah.
And it's a very beautiful line. And I love Blanchard's music in that opera. And I think it's a very fine work. And I've seen Eric Owens, and I'm suddenly trying to remember the name of the wonderful singer. He's no longer with us.
Arthur
His wife is
Woodley.
named Maria. Pardon me?
Arthur Woodley.
Arthur Woodley, and his wife Maria, I know very well, and I knew Arthur was wonderful too in a very different way from Eric Owens. It's a wonderful dramatic role because there's the grandeur of the present, but also the memory of the past. And the man who plays the younger role, in some ways, it's more athletic and charismatic, but the older role is the one, frankly, that I always care about because we see him as a shell in some way of what he was, and we understand that mores in life did not allow him to be the man that he wanted to be or could have been. Tell me about your playing the role, which I didn't see, unfortunately.
Well, I have a wonderfully deep connection with Champion. In 2013, when the opera was premiered at Opera Theater St. Louis, I was in the chorus. I was in the ensemble. It was a very small ensemble then, as opposed to the new expanded version that has been performed at the Metropolitan and then later at Lyric Opera of Chicago. But we all sort of created these characters in this atmosphere together. And watching Arthur Woodley create this character, for me as a young artist, I mean, I would go to rehearsals just to watch Arthur and to hear how he would sing the role and hear how he would sing these lines. Emil Griffith was still alive when we were working on the opera. And Terrence Blanchard and Jim Robinson, the director, and Arthur Woodley actually went to visit him in New York. And his adopted son, Luis, came to the premiere. He came to opening night. I don't know how he did it because I think we were in Tech Week. It had to be maybe a few days before the show opened. Emil Griffith died. And his adopted son decided to come to the show anyway, and he made it through about half of the show and greeted us after the performance. But it's an opera that has, and a story that has always resonated with me in terms of the act of forgiveness, the dealing with people with memory loss, because it's something that affects so many of us in many aspects of our lives, and the sense of redemption. He killed a man in a ring. Well, he went unconscious and then later died at the hospital. But he always wanted to say, I'm sorry. He said, I never meant to take away a husband, a father. Benny, I didn't mean it, which was the man's name in the opera, Benny the Kid Perrette. And finally, he gets a chance to meet Benny's son, who looks just like his father. And so he gets this sort of reconciliation that he's been yearning for years. And the line, it tears you apart because, and this is actually what happened to Emil Griffith. He was leaving a bar, and it was a gay bar, and just some people decided to bash people that were leaving the bar. They didn't know that it was Emil Griffith, and they beat him up and sort of left him in the alley. And that also aided, unfortunately, in the deterioration of his mental health and status. And but he said the line, I killed a man and the world forgave me. I love a man and the world wants to kill me. And so seeing Arthur take on this role and do it, and to see Eric's very incredibly strong portrayal and character, I mean, it was it's interesting how it came about at Lyric because I saw Terrence Blanchard here in Houston. He was doing a concert, and we were talking afterwards, and I said, Terrence, I've always wanted to do Old Emile, but I felt like I was too young. I didn't know if I could pull it off. And he said, "Yeah, I bet you'd be pretty good at that." And I said, "Okay." And a few weeks later, Jim Robinson was here in Houston, and I spoke with Jim, and I said, "Jim, you know, because I was working on Falstaff here." And he said, "Wow, you're so good and, you're doing so well." I said, "Jim, I've always wanted to do Old Emile." And he was like, I bet that would be really interesting. And, you just toss it into the wind. And about a month before rehearsals started, Eric had to withdraw from the production for personal reasons. And they said, "Well, we wonder who would be good." And they said, "I wonder if this is something Reggie Smith would be interested in." And when they reached out to Terrence, he said, "Yeah, I think he'd be good." And they reached out to Jim, and he said, "Yeah, I think he'd be good." So a month before rehearsals started, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, do you want to sing Old Emile?" And I said, well, I'm familiar with the music from listening to it from being in the chorus, but I don't know it. But if you send me a score, I can probably work on it." And so serendipitously, and nowadays they would call that manifesting. I was able to do the role at Lyric Opera of Chicago, and it's been uh, really one of the most rewarding, one of the most challenging, and one of the most heartfelt things that I've been able to do in my career. And I'm part of me also. When I made my Metropolitan Opera debut in Porgy and Bess, I sang the role of Jim. And the same person making their Metropolitan Opera debut in their 60s was Arthur Woodley. And Arthur was
Yeah,
singing Lawyer Frazier.
that's
Arthur and
right.
I shared a dressing room. And I remember I would sit and listen to Arthur warm up in the dressing room. And I said, "Arthur, I'd love to have a lesson with you." And he would say, "You don't need a lesson, man. You good, man." And I'm like, "No, I really want to." And so it was amazing to share a dressing room with him and to just hear about his career and his life and to hear him warm up. Like, those things are just so vivid to me to then step into a role that he created. Um, I, when I sing it, I really hope and pray that I honor Arthur in a way, as well as honoring the life and legacy of Emile Griffith, and hope that Emile was able to find some peace in his life, before departing this world. So anyway, it's a very, very special show to me, and I'm sure you didn't expect all the extra background for Champion by
No, I
Terrence
love this
Blanchard, but
background, to which I'm going to add some more. Number one, when people ask me what my motto is very simple: plant seeds, because they may not all grow. But what you were doing, you were planting seeds. You were saying, "Gee, I'd like to do Old Emile." You said it to some of the right people. And then when the possibility came, you plant seeds when you say, "I'll sing the Bonza, but I would like to also cover
yeah.
Sharpless." That's a lot of agriculture right there. And it's a good thing. And it leads me to another way. I don't know what you know about me. My main career is opera, but I've also written 8 cookbooks, and I'm known in the food world. And Arthur Woodley's wife, Maria Woodley, worked at the Italian Trade Commission. And I did a lot of my stuff in Italy, a lot of my food stuff and my opera training in Italy. And Maria kept telling me, um, you should get into opera. And I said, well, I'm way into opera. She said, have you ever heard of a singer named Arthur Woodley? Sure. And I've heard Arthur Woodley. And she said, that's my husband. No one here at the Italian Trade Commission knows that I'm married to a very important opera singer. And I knew Maria well, and it's through Maria that I met Arthur, actually, not through my opera work. And he died too quickly, too soon, and I miss him. He was a wonderful man. So I'm glad we had the chance to pay tribute to him.
Me
Um,
too.
And then you went right. I can't cover every single role you do because you do so many, but then you went right into Amonastro. Talk about. I know singers who, once they do a role, will then sort of pause and either do that role again or a similar kind of role, or they'll take a break before going to a different role like Amonastro or Scarpia and Tosca. You basically closed one door and opened another in a weekend. And how does that work vocally? How does that work mentally in terms of having a role in your head and then having another? Talk about that.
Well, that was it was unintentional in that matter. Fortunately, I was already cast in Aida at Lyric Opera of Chicago. And so I remember when my manager called and said, Reggie, it's about Chicago, I thought, Aida? And he said, Champion. And I said, what? I'm not in Champion. And so the way the schedule worked out, Champion ended on Sunday and Aida started on Monday. I would have loved to have had a day off. I mean, fortunately for me, Aida is a show that I've done a lot of, and fortunately, it keeps coming up because people love the opera, and I'm glad they do. So it's one that you could sort of shake me in the middle of the night and say, "Sing the Act Three duet." Ate grave canto. But so it's in the body, it's in the
Yeah.
voice, and so that was certainly helpful having to go from a modern English speaking American opera to a very Italianate, you know, romantic piece. While I was working on Champion during those performances, when I had days off, I had to go and work Aida and,
Hmm.
make sure that I was singing that long Italianate line in the midst of singing very precise English crisp diction. So I didn't go in there and start chumping everything in Italian because I'm trying to,
Well,
So
also because Amonasro, though he doesn't show up till the second act and we lose him in the third act, um, nonetheless interacts. It's a quick check.
yep.
It's like Scarpia.
Well, Scorpio's a much harder,
Yeah, I know. But what I
but
mean in terms
yes, in terms
of
of time, yes,
right,
absolutely.
I mean Don Alfonso is a longer role in a way in Così fan tutte. That's a long role.
Oh yeah.
Um, but the fact that you're working with colleagues who, for them, the woman sing Aida, the man sing Radames, the woman sing Neris, all the other, you interact with these people,
Oh yeah.
and you can't just sort of jump in, so to speak, because there's a big orchestra, there's a chorus, there's a lot of staging and blocking Act Two,
Yeah.
a lot of intimate acting in Act Three,
Hmm.
and and costuming and makeup and all that, which is very different from doing contemporary American opera. Um, that's a lot to fit in. No.
Eh, you roll with it, If you're singing Aida today and you're singing Tosca tomorrow, you just, and on Monday you start rehearsals for, I don't know, Andrea Chenier or whatever, Fortunately, I know my schedule enough, with enough time, so I know how much time it's going to take me to prepare certain things. If it's a repeat role, how long will it take to pull it back, get it in my voice? What do I need to do vocally to accomplish this role versus the other roles? Um, for instance, I talk about my concert repertoire. One thing that people are always kind of surprised by, I do a lot of holiday pops concerts.
Ah.
Yeah, different things like narrating, like I've narrated The Grinch, and "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." You do it with the orchestra, and you sing all of your, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas." Well, you go from doing the Verdi Requiem to holiday pops. And this year I'm going from holiday pops right into Hansel and Gretel. And so you learn, okay, if I'm going to do 12 holiday pops concerts, I don't need to sing with such bravado to where I'm, because we have Friday night, Saturday morning kids show, Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And so, of course, it
Where
aided
will
by
Hansel and
singing
Gretel
with a
be?
microphone. Hmm?
Where will Hansel and Gretel be? What city?
Hansel and Gretel is great because I get to stay here in my house at Houston Grand Opera.
I'll tell you why I'm asking. Um, like many kids, it was one of my first operas that I learned. My first, believe it or not, was Wozzeck, but that can tell you a lot about me. But the others were Magic Flute, Porgy and Bess, Hansel and Gretel, Tosca, and Bohème. I think and Carmen were among my first operas. But Wozzeck was the very first. But Hansel and Gretel, I remember when I learned it as a kid, was not enchanting to me. I
Hmm.
did love the music. I understood that it was beautiful music. It really is. It's not your typical kids opera because the music is a big sing. Um, I immediately learned da 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 Don't You Cry, 14 Angels in the Sky. I learned
Yeah,
it in
yeah.
English. But what I remember was these kids starving, this witch showing up and turning children into cookies or cake, trying to eat them, their mother who was having a fit because there was no food, their father Peter, a very nice man who just likes to sing. He's not exactly too worried about caring for the kids. And I found the whole thing very upsetting. And but I was sort of traumatized by these kids getting lost in the forest. Imagine me in New York City getting lost on the subway, having
Mm.
no food, being kidnapped, being turned into a piece of cake or a muffin or something, and my dad out singing and my mother panicking. That was my interpretation of that opera. Now I respect it musically, but Peter he's a very particular role
Yes.
because the music is beautiful. It's among the most beautiful in the opera. There's the Dew Fairy and the Snowman and all those people, but his music is gorgeous at the very beginning, and but he's not. You characterize him.
Well, I tend to play very good parents. We mentioned Amonasro, right? Who tells his daughter, "Non sei mia figlia." You're
E
not my daughter. You're
parole tu
just
sei
a
la
de
schiava.
faraon tu sei la schiava, right? You're just a slave. Ah. Um, and then you have Peter from Hansel and Gretel, he's like, "Oh, it's okay, all's well. I've had a good drink. I'm home. Hey, where are the kids? What's going on?"
Who knocked over the milk?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, come on, sir. But they go to rescue their children, so it's not all a loss. Um, but yeah, it's fun to mix it up and to at least it's another role like you mentioned with Tosca singing Scarpia and Tosca and Amonasro and Aida. That's not a very long role. Peter doesn't have to do the heavy lifting in the opera, which is great.
No. Um, I had one more Aida question.
Sure.
There was recently, apparently, I did not get to hear it, a rather fantastic performance in concert of Aida in Baltimore that everyone who heard it said, "Boy, did you miss that?" Or one day you're going to say you were there. I was not there. I'll say it officially. I was not in Baltimore. Talk about that performance and who was in it.
Well, it was great because the Baltimore Symphony has started this wonderful initiative with their conductor, Jonathan Hayward, who's a wonderful young conductor,
Yes.
where he wants to do not just at least one opera a year, but he wants to do a Verdi opera every year. And he wanted to start out this Verdi opera cycle with, go big or go home, right? We started with the
Mhm.
ABC, so he started with Aida. and they assembled a really fantastic cast that, of course, was led by Angel Blue, who, of course, is just divine and just a beautiful person in
She
and out.
is
I mean,
one of
she's
the
just a,
most wonderful people I've ever met. I've said
yeah,
it publicly, so I'm on the record.
yeah. We love Angel. And
Yeah,
then, of course, Lemmy Pulliam, who sings his entire face off. I mean, it was
yeah.
the two of them together was like electric, all of those duets and big battle and high notes, which we all love to hear. And of course, you throw in the mix, Jamie Barton singing I'm Theirs.
Yeah.
Like, what a way to go. Hey, I threw in my barks up there as I'm an Osro. You had Matt Ankiel, who's always a fantastic, solid singer, and then Mark Doss, who's been singing
Yeah.
for such a long time and doesn't get the
I
respect
remember
that he
when he
deserves.
started. We started
Yeah.
together a long time ago. So that means that Angel, Lemmy, Jamie, and you have now all been on my program. And I
Yeah.
want to get Jonathan Hayward pretty soon because he's great. But I
Yeah.
heard it was, I mean, from everyone who was there, it was one of those people came up from Washington, down from Philadelphia. But what if you're doing alphabetically? I'm afraid that the next opera will be Alcira by Verdi.
Now that you'd have to ask Jonathan Hayward about.
I know that, but I've actually heard Alcira once in Parma.
Wow.
I've heard
Wow.
all the Verdi operas, but I've only heard Alcira once, and it was his least successful opera, probably.
Yeah. Of
Um, but still, it's worth hearing the hero Verdi.
course.
But have you ever done any of the roles in what we call Macbeth, Verdi's Macbeth?
Not yet. Not
Which
yet.
one do you want to do?
Well, go big or go home. I'll do the title role.
Yeah, okay, not bad.
Nah.
Yeah. Well, because he goes home early. It's another one of those.
That's true. But it's one of those like if you're gonna do the role, let's do it. It's like Falstaff.
Yeah.
Uh,
All right, so let's talk about Falstaff, one of my very favorite operas, and I understand one of your very favorite operas. It's kind of perfect, but it's one of the hardest operas to sing of all.
yes.
Acting too, but just as a sing because it's through composed in a way that only Otello in some way reached. But it's a thing unto itself. It was Verdi's last opera. It was a comedy. He had a very anguished personal life at that point. His wife had died, and he was very depressed. He was not happy with how Italy's unification was working. And Arrigo Boito, the librettist who did Otello and was a composer, thought he would get the old man out of his funk by sending him a charming libretto. And he did, and Verdi rejected it. He said, I have nothing else to say. But then he's wrote in Italian, I've gotten old John inside of me, being Sir John Falstaff. And when he began to work on that, Va Vecchio John, he suddenly was enlivened, let's say,
Mhm.
by Boito, by the subject, and produced this masterpiece that I think is funnier than any other opera, including Rossini. And I mean, Rossini has some good funny operas, and so does Donizetti. But there's just something so universally humane about this opera that's also the lessons of an old man who can laugh. Tutto il mondo è burla. The whole world is a joke. And yes, it is, but also it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Think of the alternative. And so when did you start learning it? Where did you start studying it? How did you get into it? Because it's an enormous role, but it's not
So,
easy.
well, what, really in sort of a crazy way, we did the opera Falstaff at my undergraduate university. And they have graduate students, master's, doctoral students. And I was an undergraduate. I was doing my fifth year because I did music education and performance. And so I took the
Mhm.
extended stay route in college. And I auditioned because I thought, well, maybe they'll cast me to sing Ford. And I did the audition. It went well. And they said, we want you to sing Falstaff. And I said, mm-mm, mm-mm. I think I was 22, something like that. And I said, nope, absolutely not. And they said, no, we really think you can do it. And it's a university production. And I thought, "Argh." And so I told my teacher, I said, okay, if I do this, you're going to have to hold my hand through the whole process. You know, we need to go scene by scene. You're going to have to come to rehearsals and check in to make sure that I'm not screwing anything up. And it went very well, thank God. And then the following summer, they were doing Falstaff at Brevard Music Center in North Carolina, which is a great summer program for orchestra and opera. And I had been in the program before, and they said, we're doing Falstaff, but we don't have anyone to sing Falstaff. We'd like to bring you back as a guest artist, and we'll pay you to do the role. We know you just did the role. And I said, okay, I enjoyed it. I'll do it one more time. Twist my arm. Done. And so I did it I was 23 at the time. And I said, okay, enough of this. Now, I will say, I've gone back to listen to those recordings, and that was some pretty darn good singing of Falstaff at 23. It wasn't bad. But all through my time, after that, I joined the Houston Grand Opera Studio, and I actually auditioned for Houston Grand Opera singing a paggio from Falstaff.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into the program, they said, nope, you don't need to sing this. Sing Ford. So I said, okay. I learned Ford's aria. It went very well. It was one of the pieces I did to win the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions. And
I
so
was there.
thank you. So it was, that was my aria. I was singing Ford, but no one was interested in hiring me for Ford, which is understandable. And so I just sort of, put it out of sight. I thought, well, it'll come around at some point. And so when they decided to do it here at Houston Grand Opera, they reached out and said, we'd love for you to do Falstaff, not Ford. And I thought, well, okay, sure. And it was so funny to me because they kept saying, oh, this is his first time doing Falstaff. He's working on this for the first time. And I'm like, no, I auditioned for you all singing Falstaff. And so in many ways, it was a cool sort of full circle moment that the piece that I auditioned with, I got to do the entire opera here at Houston Grand Opera. But I will say, I'm glad that I worked on it early on and worked on it carefully with my teacher and got to do it on stages that were not on a big scene where people were coming to see it. Because then when I came back to the role, 10, 12 years later, one, I was still remembered most of it and the text. I had a deeper sense of understanding of the character, and I had a deeper understanding of how to make it through vocally, because there's 6 scenes in Falstaff, and Falstaff is in 5 of the 6 scenes. So you're just constantly on stage, and it goes up and it goes down, and then it's funny, and then it's bigger, and so I knew from learning it early on and from having sort of trial performances, I knew how to pace myself, so that when we got to the bigger moments that I wasn't overextending myself. So anyway, that's my Falstaff story. Now that I've
Also,
done it,
because
I'd love to do
in
it
every
again for people listening.
sure plant those seeds in every in every single production. There's a great deal of physicality, especially in the scene where Falstaff is put in a laundry basket. He's a big man, and they dump him out into the Thames River. And then we meet him usually after the intermission, although sometimes they don't do an intermission. And he's all wet. He's chilly. He sings this aria Mondo Reo, an ugly world.
Yeah.
And he needs a little sherry, a little something to warm his system. And you could hear it in the music how he's being revitalized by that little sip and that warming uh, booze, let's call it. But on the other hand, also by the kindness of the bartender.
Yeah.
That's what always strikes me in that scene, because in the other scenes he's commanding, he's boisterous, it's funny. But in this one, someone is being kind to him at a moment when he's down. So it sort of revives him for the final scene, which is this fugue, 14 different voices. I had the great fortune to work a lot with James Levine. This was one of his favorite works. And I was involved in a production, I think in 92, with Morella Freeney, Marilyn Horne, as quickly, Paul Plishka.
Oh
And
yeah.
it was a wonderful cast. It's on video. And so I've worked with many people who've done this. Bryn Tervel was a great Falstaff for a long time. And then I can tell you the year 2001, before 9/11. I'm a New Yorker. It was just a few months before, weeks before, um, was the 100th anniversary of the death of Verdi. He died in January of 1901. And at the Verdi Festival in Parma, they were doing in the big theater in the Teatro Regio certain operas. And then in the little theater in Busseto, the town that he's from, um, they have a theater of about 350 seats
Mm.
that Verdi saw in his lifetime. He didn't like it, but he saw it. And he, Riccardo Muti, wanted to conduct Falstaff in that little theater with a
Wow.
tiny cast. I once saw an Aida in there with Daniela Da C and Fabio Mediato,
Wow.
directed by Franco Zeffirelli with a cast of 32, which is nothing for Aida, but it worked. Um, but in this case, Riccardo Muti wanted to find a young singer, Ambrogio Maestri, who had never sung the role. And Muti taught him the role to do that summer in Busseto. And I remember thinking how incredibly prepared this man was. But Maestri grew in every sense in the role through the years and is wonderful at it. But I remember thinking that he had Riccardo Muti to teach him the role. Barbara Friedli played Alice. It was a very good cast, especially for such a tiny theater. And but Maestri, who I have come to know through the years, said, "I'm only beginning to understand this character as he
Mm.
gets older. And you're a younger man." And that's why I was asking you about what the character can tell you, because Verdi was an old man when he wrote it, and he wrote it from the perspective of life experience. And if you played it at 23, I'm sure you were wonderful, but only scratching the surface of what the emotional texture was in
Yes.
terms of his rejection by women, in terms of his view of life, in terms of his being rather disjointed in his current world because he's Sir John Falstaff, but he's not the Sir that anybody acknowledges that way. He's sort
Yes.
of like, old society, but not relevant. And I mean, it's just such a brilliant role. And the women are great too, of course. But when you did it in Houston, who were some of the women who were in the cast with you?
Well, I was fortunate to do it with Nicole Houston
Oh,
as Alice, who's always great, wonderful singer and
yeah.
great colleague, and we had a blast. And with Andrea Carroll,
Mm-hmm.
which was also very cool because Andrea and I did. We were at Siegel, which is a summer music program in upstate New York, at 19 and 20 years old, and
The Adirondack Mountains,
and
yes.
the Adirondack Mountains.
Beautiful up there. Beautiful.
And then we shared a year. We overlapped by 1 year in the Houston Grand Opera Studio. And then, to come back years later and to do this show, she sang Nanetta, or she performed
Uh-huh.
Nanetta, and it was really, really awesome. Just, sometimes that's one of the joys of the business is meeting friends and sort of seeing them through the years in different places and reconnecting, and so that was a really cool experience.
And who was Quickly?
Jennifer Johnson Cano,
Oh, it was great.
who
Um,
which we
yes.
did the opera Castor and Patience, which is a new opera by Greg Spears, and Jennifer Johnson Cano played my wife in that opera. And so to come back and have her do Quickly, it made the connection between Falstaff and Quickly even better. We were already sort of connected as husband and wife. So,
Because I've seen
Quickly had a
her in
little,
some ways, not as the female Falstaff, but as someone who is older than the other women, who
yeah,
has life experience, who is a bit cynical, but also smarter in some ways than Falstaff is. And I think she really kind of likes him.
yeah, I do
And
too.
that's the thing, is that you could almost begin to think that they could have a romantic relationship if he
Yeah,
didn't stop sending letters. Well,
to
let's say
everyone.
to everyone. I was going to say just Megan to Alice, but to everyone is true. Looking for an assignation and so on. I think that if he quote settled down, that he and Quickly would be a fun couple.
Yeah, I do too.
But then I think the Macbeths are a fun couple, so don't ask me.
That's the vote set coming out. It's okay.
I know. Well, actually, I'll tell you the story there. Ian McKellen, the great Shakespearean actor, used to do between his big films and plays a one-man show called Acting Shakespeare, and he brought it to New York City. And he would talk about how Shakespeare created conflict by the fact that the couples, there was always, something not quite
Mhm.
working, a disagreement, and so on. And he asked rhetorically the audience, can you name any happy couple in Shakespeare? And people called out a few, and he said no, and he explained why. And I raised my hand and I said, the Macbeths. And Ian McKellen paused. He said, oh my goodness, you're right. They have a like-minded view. They have the same goals. It doesn't work out, but they have the same goals.
Right.
And it's interesting. Um, so one role that among many that you are famous for is Porgy and Porgy and Bess. And it's an opera that has a very long, magnificent legacy. It's much discussed. I don't know how much we have to talk about the history of the opera here. It's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Every note is gorgeous. The story is beautiful. To me, it's fully an opera. It's everything that an opera needs to be. Um, and I wrote you ahead of time and I asked about certain artists who you admire, and you mentioned Donnie Ray Albert, who was not my first Porgy because I was 5 years old, but I saw him in the Houston Grand Opera production with Clamadale. And that was entirely unforgettable. And I'm getting goosebumps now as I think about it. They were the best Porgy and Bess team that I've ever seen. I've seen many wonderful Porgies, many wonderful Besses and Mariahs, and the whole role, the whole opera. But there was something about the energy between Donnie Ray Albert and Clamadale that I've never seen before or since. And do you know him?
I do. I do.
You talk about Donnie Ray Albert. I've never met him, but I think the world of him.
So I've mentioned this several times to as much as I can, everywhere I can. The representation matters, right? So when I was a young high school
Reggie,
student,
because we have an international audience, I know exactly what you mean about
oh,
representation. But
I
please
was gonna
define
get into it, I promise.
it. Okay, go
I'll
for
give you the full story. It makes it worthwhile.
it.
So I was saying representation matters, right? So when I was a student in high school, I went to a performing arts high school, which is, sort of more than just your regular American high school, sort of a charter school, and you can do all these things. But one of the most important things is that at the performing arts high school, we would go to the final dress rehearsals and, sort of some performances of opera, musical theater, jazz concerts, etc. And so I was very familiar with musical theater. I was very familiar with the symphony and going to choir concerts, but I'd never seen an opera on stage, just unamplified human voice, big set, so on. And they said, do you want to go and see the opera Tosca? And I said, I don't know anything about that. And, but it was during the school day. And I thought, well, you know what? You pay $5 or $10 and you get out of school for most of the day. Sure. And At the time, I knew of African American opera singers such as Paul Robeson or Marian Anderson or Leontine Price, but I didn't know that there were African American singers that were still singing, that were making careers doing this thing, and certainly not African American male singers, because unfortunately we don't talk about them nearly as much as we talk about our female counterparts, which are really wonderful, but you know, something to throw in the back of your head there. And so, fast forward to Tosca. Here I am at 15 years old, and the soprano and the tenor are singing, and it's wonderful. And then Scarpia comes out, Un tal bacaro inquieta. And this sound is like, wow, what is this sound? And it's sort of ringing in the theater, and I'd never heard anything like it. And here's this African American man on stage, commanding the stage with this magnetic voice and fantastic energy. And I couldn't take my eyes off of him. And I also didn't realize that there were Black singers in opera doing the thing, you know. And that was the first time that I saw someone on stage or saw someone in this medium, this genre, that looked like me, that, you know, and what it did is it made me go back to my teacher, and I said, I don't know who this person is, but I want to learn all that I can about them. And I remember Donnie Ray Albert had just released a CD called In Recital. And I went and I bought it, and I downloaded it to my iPod at the time. And, and I learned every song on it just because I said, I don't know who he is, but I want to sing like him. I want to do that. And I started taking voice lessons, and it's because I saw Donnie Ray Albert on stage in this opera that it made me really want to be a singer, and really want to try to sing this opera stuff and see if I could do it like him. And so that's what I mean by representation matters, is I saw someone that looked like me, and it gave me an inspiration and a hope to think, wow, maybe I can do this too one day. And so I hope I do that for other people.
What is unfortunate, but I think is sadly true, is that when I began my career, there was an African American tenor, wonderful, named George Shirley,
Of course.
who teaches. There was Vincent Cole. These two gentlemen were both light skinned and were tenors and cast as romantic roles, but they were sort of the only two. And I knew wonderful Black tenors who were darker skinned, who were not being cast because they were romantic leads. And it took more years for people like Lawrence Brownlee and Russell Thomas and many more to come along. Kenneth Tarver sang a lot of concert work, but not so much in opera. Wonderful tenor, especially in Berlitz, which is not easy to find. Kenneth Hicks, wonderful singer ahead of his time. And now finally, companies are, and it's not perfect, but they're better, are casting Black tenors in romantic leads, whereas Black baritones and basses, the fathers, the villains, and so on, were being cast more.
Right.
So Donnie Ray Albert thankfully was able to sing that. And he also sang Porgy, not just Porgy. He was a fantastic Porgy, but obviously did not only sing Porgy. I've known Black singers who did not want to sing in Porgy and Bess because they felt they would be confined by that.
Yes. So it's interesting you say that. But my very first role, my professional operatic debut, was singing Lawyer Frazier in Porgy and Bess, and that was at Cincinnati Opera. And I have done Porgy and Bess several times, singing Jim, I've covered Crown, and I did Jake, I think, oh my Lord, 4 times, 5 times. And so the opera itself is very special to me, and the world of Porgy and singing with so many colleagues, and it's great. But I was offered the title role of Porgy when I was 25. And I was fresh out of the Houston Grand Opera studio. I was a little bird that had just got, I'd just been kicked out of the nest and trying to
Mhm.
spread my wings and fly. And, I was offered a nice chunk of changes, for a 25-year-old and particularly. And I remember talking to certain people. I talked with certain colleagues that had performed the role, um, African American men and other people just for their opinions and their thoughts and concerns. And that was a big concern is that, you don't want to get stuck in the role. Now, of course, the only way you get stuck in the role is if you keep taking them. But if that's the only thing that people are offering and you don't have anything else, it kind of creates a, what do you do sort of situation. So I said that I want to do the role and I want it to be a part of my repertoire and a part of my legacy as an artist, but I don't want it to be the entirety of my repertoire and the entirety of my legacy. I want people to know me and to hear me in different things before they hear and see me as Porgy. So that when I take on the role, that it will be a part of what I do and not all of what I do. And so I specifically waited to do the role until I felt that I was ready and that I was at a place in my career where I could take on the role and still do other things.
I worked on the 1985 production of Porgy and Bess at the Met, not the current one, but the first one.
Yeah.
And we had a fantastic cast. At that time, and probably still now, the Gershwin estate required that all Black singers be hired for the chorus. And it was very expensive to produce not only at the Met, but because you had to pay the regular chorus for their night off. The Black artists in the regular chorus were not necessarily in Porgy and Bess because they were in the Met chorus. And the Met more recently, this is great, when they did Porgy with the new production, found great singers in the Porgy chorus and got them into the Met chorus. But at
Yes.
that time, it was a completely separate thing because of legality. And we had James Levine conducting. We had a very full score because there were debates about what music to include or not. But every note that Gershwin wrote was there that night. Grace Bumbry was a remarkable but difficult Bess, and I loved her. I mean, I worked with her a lot, and I adored her, but she was a handful. And Simon Estes was the wonderful Porgy, but the chemistry between Grace Bumbry and Simon Estes was not the greatest. They were vocally fantastic. Grace wore a red dress and she was all over the stage. And Crown was a very handsome young former athlete named Greg Baker, and he was a terrific singer. And the whole cast was great. Barbara Conrad and I became very close friends. Did you ever know her?
I didn't get to know her, but I definitely know who she
She was a
is,
Texan,
certainly.
and she was faced racism early on as a singer and very publicly confronted it. And she was a wonderful woman. She unfortunately had dementia or Alzheimer's late in life, but she and I became very, very close. And the whole cast was terrific. Veronica Tyler, who I don't know if people know her, was Serena. It was a beautifully cast production, even if Simon Estes and Grace Bumbry seemed to arrive from two different places. But I mention this because Simon Estes in this production did the full physicality of the role. In other words, he was on a cart. We had a real live goat. So at the end, when he says, "Bring me my goat," I'm on my way, where's New York, and so on. And Serena and Mariah and the others are imploring him, "Don't go, you're going to die." It was so tragic. The audience was in tears. And when he navigated that goat out the gate and was going to New York, everybody on the stage was in tears. And in the current production, I didn't quite see that. It was a much more, I would say, professional cast. I think because in 1985, they felt they were doing something very new at the Met. They were. And the chorus members who were not in the Met chorus were so moved by this thing that, and seeing these great artists doing that was an extraordinary event. But physically, it was the hardest production I ever worked on. And we had many stage accidents and injuries. And without getting too graphic, because goats have things that they leave behind,
Yeah.
and people were slipping in that and falling, and there were terrible injuries. And there was in the fight in the first act when I believe it's Jake who's killed.
Robbins.
Robbins is killed. Yes, you're right. Jake gets to sing more beautiful music. Robbins
And
is
then he
killed.
dies.
And then he does. He dies drowning. But Robbins, of course, Serena, his wife, sings, My Man's Gone Now. But there were so many physical accidents in that stage that it was scary. And Grace Bunbury never got injured, but everyone else did. And it was, I never thought they'd come back with that. They did, but they got rid of the goat. So my first question is, have you ever worked with a goat?
No, but fortunately, I mentioned Donnie Ray Albert. I have had the great pleasure of meeting, knowing, talking to, working with Donnie Ray Albert. And when I finally took on the role of Porgy, I reached out to him, and I was able to work on the show with him,
Mhm.
one bit at a time. And he was telling me when they went on tour back in the day, they actually toured with the goat as well.
Yeah.
And except when they went to Canada, because they couldn't figure out, I guess the goat didn't have a passport. And so when they were in Canada, they had to use a Canadian goat. But fortunately, I have not had to deal with the goat on stage. But it's very fun to hear his stories about. I can't remember what he said the name of the goat was, but it was
Well, I mentioned
it
it
was a
because
stage goat.
it sounds comic, and from a production point of view, it was a nightmare. But the pathos of this man, Simon Estes, a large man who, by the way, let's not forget, fantastic Wagnerian singer for many years before that,
Absolutely.
and came from that direction. And while Grace had sung Wagner, she sang anything you put in front of her, and she sang it beautifully. But Estes was a great Wagnerian singer,
Oh yeah.
and that was his line, so to speak. But then to see him not doing the Flying Dutchman, but doing this role where he literally was on his knees for the entire production. I've seen every production around, and it was done recently on Broadway with Audra McDonald in a
Yeah.
modified version, and I'm suddenly forgetting this wonderful
Norm
actor's
Lewis.
Norm Lewis,
Yeah,
yeah,
Norm
from Florida,
Lewis.
who had crutches and braces on, and he sort of went around the stage on crutches. And they were trying to minimize the disability, and they were trying to politically correct it and not use words like cripple. And it was 1922, 23, 24 when this opera is set. And that was the terminology of then. And while we don't encourage the use of the word cripple, and I've been disabled in my life at certain points, and I was called a crip by people, and it's not nice. But in the context of that opera, I think we need to see more disability, because the challenges he faces in, spoiler alert, in Killing Crown, in that he is, even though he's disabled and Crown is, built like Adonis, somehow Porgy, through spirit, through tenacity, through whatever, manages to kill Crown. And it's a very dramatic moment, but it's more dramatic because he can't stand up. And so the stagings I've seen lately, in some cases, not all cases, minimize the disability. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yes, I just completed the Francesca Zambello production, which definitely you see Porgy. He has one crutch and a leg brace. And there are many times in the production where you fall to the ground, for, of course, different reasons. He's trying to reach for sporting life and misses him, and, he falls and he has a hard time sort of getting back up. And so I think well thought out, and if it has a reason, I think that's sort of the case for any production and any opera. Like, you have to have a full thought out understanding and interpretation. And there are times where, for instance, before the trio, "Oh Bess, Where's My Bess," there was a moment in rehearsal where Francesca Zambello said, "I want Porgy to start the aria really the aria, the trio, on his knees." And this is after you've already killed Crown. And she said, "Well, I want you to reach for Mariah, and, you're reaching for Mariah and you fall to the ground, and then you start from there." And I thought, well, that doesn't work for my character. And that doesn't work for my version of of what's happened. He's just had all this strength to kill a man and overcome being in jail. And, it seemed like he all of a sudden was sort of giving up, in a sense. And I didn't like that. And so I said, can we try, he's on the crutch and he's sort of banging his crutch on the ground, and he's so frustrated that he throws his crutch and then gets down as if he's pleading to Mariah, "Bess, won't somebody tell me where?" And when we did that in the rehearsal, she was like, "Oh, that was it was a stronger choice." So in many ways like that, you find a way of, I think, through good communication and good intentionality, of finding a way to make ideas work and meeting in the middle to where it doesn't diminish the character. Because I didn't want Porgy to be seen as weak in that moment. I wanted him to be pleading and saying, "Where is she? Why won't anyone tell me?" And in the height of his frustration, and he gets on his knees, and in the version that I like to do, which I definitely have picked from other Porgy, so I'm not saying I did it myself. Alvy Powell would do it all the time, and I saw Kenny Overton do it, where he's singing, "I gotta be with Bess," where he tries to stand up and he tries to walk, and then his legs give out. And so you're on the ground for, "God, help me find her. I'm on my way." And then he finds a way to pull himself back up, even if it's just on his knees to start. "Oh Lord," I remember
By then
seeing
I'm
it
in
in the
tears.
theater. Huh?
By then I'm already in tears.
Exactly. Same here.
The trio, they start coming, but when there are two notes in the orchestra, deep, deep, just right there, and then this is his decision. You can hear it in the notes in the orchestra, and off he goes to New York. And do you think he gets to New York, or does he not get out of South Carolina?
In my own personal version, I don't think he makes it at all. But I
No,
think
I
he
don't like
tries
it.
as hard as he can.
Yeah.
And, I think it's up to the person who's watching. Some people say, you know what, he has the strength, maybe he will actually make it. He's just so determined. Um, and it's his courage, it's his strength that strove with his last ounce of courage, if you will, to take from Man of La Mancha, that he's gonna try no matter what to make it. And that's the part of, but it is very sad in the sense that
Oh God, it's classic tragedy. I always point out to people that the original book was called Porgy. It was not called Porgy and Bess.
that is
And it
correct.
was his story. And
Yeah.
Bess is an important character, but it's his story. So I'm going to detour, but this is not a detour. When I teach opera, which I do a lot of, and I teach Porgy and Bess, I tend to teach it with another opera Cavalleria Rusticana. And the reason I do that, there are a few reasons. One is because there are some people who criticize the use of language in Porgy and Bess, that it's people don't speak that way, but I'm saying it's 100 years ago. Um, the Sicilian that is spoken in Cavalleria Rusticana is not the way Italians speak. And there's a thing in the community in that opera that there are the insiders and then there are a couple of outsiders. And it's the same in Porgy and Bess. And the
Yeah.
chorus, when I teach one and teach the other, people suddenly understand that Porgy and Bess indeed is an opera. It was written about 35 or 40 years after Cavalleria Rusticana. And you've been in Cavalleria Rusticana.
Yeah.
So, am I on to anything?
Absolutely. I mean, I also love the phrase of Porgy and Bess being the American Verismo opera,
Yeah.
and it's especially in Cavalleria, you have this sense of everyone knows what's going on, but ain't nobody saying nothing. And you have Alfio when Alfio comes back at the end and he says, they're fine. When he sort of acknowledges the fact that he knows Turidu is cheating with his wife, everyone just says, "Whoops! Oh, you know what? It's time to go home. Maybe I left something on the stove."
Yeah.
Everyone just dissipates. And it's you find some of those same moments at the end of Porgy and Bess, right?
Yeah.
Porgy
But
comes
also
back.
the big presence of the church, of religion,
Absolutely.
and who's allowed
Absolutely.
in and who's not. To me, Mama Lucia, who's the mother of Turidu and the only person who talks to the excommunicated Santuzza, is a combination of Mariah and Serena,
Yes.
in some ways, except she's a mother, and Mariah is more like a businesswoman. But I would say Mariah is the secular mayor, and Serena is the spiritual leader. And
Yeah,
between the two, they cover all of that for the town. And you turn to one, you turn to the other. But Mama Lucia is that in her tavern, that
that's right.
she's a wise older person. It's a smaller role. And Santuzza is not Bess. They're different characters, but there's a lot of commonality.
Yeah,
Turido certainly is not Porgy, except that Turido is he's a mix of Crown and some of the others.
yeah, yeah.
And what's his name? Alfio, who kills him, is kind of Crown. It's some of those characters. It's not that there's a complete overlay, but if you get one,
Yes,
get the
yes.
other.
And also the importance of the ensemble.
Yeah.
The people, the townspeople. It's a whole character, within itself. It's not just you can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
They help to really make those scenes come to life. And if you think about like Porgy and Bess, the Lawyer Frazier scene, your name, Bess. Everyone in the town joins in. So it's just one of
That's a
those things.
complication.
That is a complication. And so, but no, I think that's a great pairing. And also it really shows the elements of verismo that you find in the traditional Italian opera that you see in Porgy and Bess. It's a
There's
wonderful
another pairing
coordination.
I teach that I stumbled into it. I didn't plan this, whereas the one I just described, I did plan. I've had the honor of teaching at West Point occasionally, the
Mm,
American Army Military Academy north of New York City. And they're wonderful, bright, perceptive, serious thinking people, cadets, the men and women. And a number of years ago, I was teaching them Aida and Così fan tutte. And
mm,
that was what was on at the Met. And they came for 2 nights in a row. And I thought Aida would be the opera that would rouse all the discussion. Così would be something different. As it turned out, Aida was very clear to them about obligation and country and sacrifice and so on. That they got, and it was no issue. But what really
mm.
threw them was Così fan tutte, because when the boys, Guglielmo and Ferrando, pretend to go off to war, and their girlfriends, Lament Dorabella and Fiordiligi. Many of the cadets found that very offensive because they thought, how can we make fun of something like going off to war? And how can the boys come back and pretend to be soldiers? And how disrespectful and how cynical is Don Alfonso, and how cunning and dishonest is Despina, the maid, the servant, whatever, who collaborates. She's a woman, but she also collaborates with Don Alfonso. So again, the genius of Da Ponte and Mozart, that they could make something so provocative that we think of as a light sex comedy that's out of date. When I learned this from the West Pointers, that Aida was clear and Così fan tutte was the complicated one. That's part of my love opera. So you've played Don Alfonso.
I have.
In this vast range of repertory. Talk about that production, which was in San Diego, I think.
It was.
And the interpretation, because it's perhaps the opera most open to interpretation of any opera I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that makes Così fan tutte very interesting to produce, to direct, because you can sort of play the characters in different scenarios and still get the general idea across. In this production, we started out with sort of guys in the locker room, and you could say they were golfing or whatever it was, sort of locker room banter where these two young kids are talking about, oh, my girlfriend's so great, oh, my girlfriend's so great, and here's the cynical old man like, kids, and so he makes the bet with them. And it was an interesting idea that Don Alfonso was sort of the one pulling the strings at all times. And so there were times where, Don Alfonso probably wasn't singing, but he was around on stage, putting things in certain places to make sure that they saw, or pushing the guys towards the women when, which made for an extra long night.
It's a very long opera.
Yeah, well, and especially for Don Alfonso, who has all of the recits and, putting things in place, to then have moments where he's just not on stage. Or there was a really funny scene, and I wish I could find the picture. I know I have it somewhere, where they had a moon sort of rising in the background at one point, while I think it was Ferrando, whatever his name, was talking to one of the ladies. And at that point, the moon turns around and it's my face in the moon, like looking down, like, and then it turns back around, So it's like Don Alfonso's always like creeping in to make sure the plan is working. But it was fun, and I had a big old beard and goatee, so that was also pretty cool. At one point, for whatever reason, Despina and Don Alfonso were dressed as a cow. They were in disguise, productions. But we joked that we had cowiography. I know, terrible, absolutely terrible. But
it became a moot point.
Yes, well played. But no, it was fun, and the audience really enjoyed it. And again, it didn't interrupt the point and the story of the opera, and so that we were all game for. But as you mentioned, in addition to Don Alfonso, even though it's probably not even listed there, I performed Taddeo in Italian Girl in Algiers.
Wow.
I performed Bartolo, Dr. Bartolo, and then
Vigano or Barbieri?
No, and then Barbieri.
Okay.
In Nozze, I've performed Antonio the gardener, Figaro, and the
That's
Count
a role I could
twice.
The only role I've ever played in an opera was in Johnny Schicchi. You want to guess which role?
Which one was it? The guy laying in
Corvus.
Buoso.
Povero Buoso. Sposo Donati.
Whoa, no, nah. It's
So
amazing.
Reggie Smith, there's a very famous comedian actress from Texas named Carol Burnett, who at the end of her show sings, "I'm so glad we had this time together," just to have a laugh and sing a song. Seems we just get
Let's get
started, and
started.
before you know it, it's time we have to say so long.
That's
This has
it.
been the quickest 90 minutes and a wonderful conversation. I would love to do this again in front of an audience in New York sometime, because it's really
Absolutely.
a pleasure to talk to you. And Reginald, I'll say your full name, Reginald Smith Jr., I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Fred.